Hi people, hope you're all having a good day. I was up late last night and I came across some interesting Vice documentaries, Vice News. Um, I think it's a good channel. I think, some people might look at certain videos and think it's biased one way or the other, but I do think they've got a good mix. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that isn't necessarily um, I don't like the term mainstream news, but it's stuff that doesn't always get the sort of attention it should. They had an episode, for example, on bride kidnapping in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan to be precise. They've had episodes on all sorts of things. Moonshine epidemics in Uganda. Um, there was an interesting one last night on America's only football hooligan. This was a guy in Florida actually modeling himself on British football louts of the 80s and 90s. Um, so yeah, I think Vice is an interesting channel, but one segment that I came across, or it was a series rather, is Decade of Hate, and this was focusing on the rise of neo-Nazi and far-right groups across Europe and North America. Um, watch a few of these videos. There was one on Russian neo-Nazis, and I think it's very important that they aired that because a big narrative, we passed the 6 month yesterday of the Ukraine war. A big narrative of Putin and his regime has been this thing about liberating Ukraine from Nazis or fighting Nazis. And Russians have been indoctrinated with this stuff. Um, and whilst it's true that there will be neo-Nazis in Ukraine, there is groups like the Azov Battalion with shady record and some shady views as well. It's the worst sort of whataboutery. No, it's worse than that. It's openly deceptive. I sort of see it as a pickpocket, excuse me, a burglar denouncing a pickpocket, because the sort of neo-Nazi groups that get a free pass in Russia essentially um, far outweigh anything that's going on in Ukraine, even before this invasion. One of the most notorious is a group called the Russian Imperial Movement. Um, it's a very violent paramilitary neo-Nazi organization. Now, in Russia, they've occasionally had material banned, but the Kremlin has clearly used this group to incite terror in Donbass and Luhansk and elsewhere. So, really, this idea that Putin's fighting Nazism, I mean, it doesn't really cover it to say he should look at his own backyard. And when I see Westerners say, "Oh, what about the Nazis in Ukraine?" I really wish they would look at what's going on in Russia. If they're truly, whether they're motivated by ideology, like they're opposed to Nazism, great. So am I. Well, look at what's going on in Russia. Anyway, that was an interesting one. There was also one on the far right and eco extremes. So this juxtaposition of neo-Nazi ideology and environmentalism. It's not as strange as it might sound because a big part of far right imagery and symbolism is in paganism, which of course takes its root from nature in pre-industrial times. So it's not that surprising the neo-Nazis would try to utilize that. Um, and I don't think it's surprising at all that extremes can cross over. Um, I once came across someone in a video documentary. I can't remember precisely what it was now. I mean, what the focus was, but this person actually said, "Well, comrades, they were either a neo-Nazi branching over to communism or a communist branching over to neo-Nazism because of their contempt for the globalists. It was one way or the other. It doesn't really matter because this branching out and this crossover is perhaps more common than it seems. People so trapped in the little vortex of delusion and hate that They will actually endorse other extremes. I mean, it's a bit like white supremacist neo-Nazi types who talk about the invasion of Europe, um, but they'll openly be okay with Islamist extremists because they're anti-Jewish. So it's kind of nonsensical, contradictory. But anyway, there was a lot of documentaries like this. What one interesting look was how these groups have galvanized, not after the Norway attacks, as you might expect, but after the New Zealand attacks, because apparently, the notion that Anders Breivik had in Norway that other neo-Nazis would follow him didn't quite come to fruition on the grounds that most of his victims were white. They were children, and even neo-Nazi groups were savvy enough not to openly endorse that. Whereas Tarrant targeted Muslims, and with some pretty disgusting endorsements of his action in far right forums. And I saw one which was very sickening. A little girl, um, she was a child. I mean, on camera, saying something like, "Well done on the 50 mark," or because he killed 50 people. 51, I think it was actually. It's sick. I mean, very. There is something very, very poisonous about this. About the worldview. I mean, that goes without saying. The racism, obviously, but it's beyond that. Even it's beyond that. But what I want to talk about, I could talk about the existence of the far right and neo-Nazi groups. I do think some conservatives downplay it. They might not fully endorse it, but I do think they downplay it. If I'm being honest, I mean the argument here is if we look at pure body counts, to put it crudely, the amount of people killed by Islamist extremism far, far outweighs the amount of people killed by neo Nazis. Unless, of course, you count the invasion of Ukraine as a fascistic act by Russia. But in terms of terrorist attacks, the amount of people killed and wounded by Islamism far, far outweighs those killed by far right incidents. I mean, if you look at attacks in Europe, for example, but that's a very grim sort of outlook to get into this realm of it should be some sort of competition. The truth is, both are dangerous. Both groom young people. Both are capable of extreme violence. Um, but in all of this, the question is how can it be tackled? I do think that online radicalization is an aspect. I think there's crossover, like I say. So, for example, the so-called incel community, there's unquestionably crossover there with some far right neo-Nazi ideas. It's not universal. This is not straightforward. It's not like incel communities equal neo-Nazis equal anti-globalists equal conspiracy theory. It's really, really not that simple. There is crossover, unquestionably. So there's a reasonable chance that someone gravitating to those incel groups will be sympathetic to some ideas being pushed by far right types about the Great Replacement theory, for example. Um, I don't buy into the Great Replacement theory. I think it's extreme hyperbole at best. But I think it's willfully dishonest. I mean, it gets into this idea of white people deliberately being replaced. What we do see is demographic changes, and sometimes if that's coming at a fast pace, I think it is a problem. So I'm not turning a blind eye to, for example, if you have, let's say, a large influx of migrants to an area where there's high unemployment, which is already struggling with poverty, clearly that's going to induce tensions. And there are demographic shifts. For example, in the East End of London, there was a documentary made a few years ago, rather provocatively titled "The Last Whites of the East End." I watched some clips of it. I'm going to watch it in full. I think there are things going on in terms of demographic shifts, but the problem with the Great Replacement theory is it gets into conspiracy theory territory where there's actually an agenda by governments to push this, like to push mass immigration onto as they would call it, indigenous people in order to replace the whites. And sometimes this gets into really questionable territory. Majid Nawaz on LBC was debating with one of his listeners, and this listener was claiming that he's not really British, even though he was born in this country. And it's this confusion of ethnicity with nationality that far right types often come out with. Or I'll rephrase that, not necessarily far right types, but people who might gravitate that way. Um, if someone is born in the United Kingdom, they're a British citizen, whether they be black, white, or Asian. Now, ethnically, yeah, they would be British Asian or black British. Um, but this idea of saying that someone has no right to call themselves British because they're not white is absurd. And it's extremely unreasonable. Of course, in that exchange, Nawaz was making the very valid point that he would have found an ally in Nawaz in terms of underrepresentation, in terms of issues like um, the fact that white working class boys are least likely to go to university. This brings me to my the point I want to make with this video. Um, Firstly, I think these neo-Nazi groups are disgusting. I think they're treacherous because we fought against that in World War Two. I mean, it goes without saying, people who are idolizing Adolf Hitler and the whole ideology around that are insulting. They're insulting our ancestors who died in that struggle. Um, I do think they're treacherous. Um, and the sick little vortex absolutely needs to be challenged. They use all these euphemisms like um, they're quite savvy about it as well. It, for example, is a well-known reference to the 8th of August. I believe it was Hitler's birth date. But things like that. It's in countries like Germany and Austria where Nazi symbolism is illegal, they find ways around it. But I don't think people should downplay what they're capable of at all. I think they're toxic and I think they should be challenged. But I also feel that left is partly responsible for fanning the flames. Now, I want to be clear about this. Everybody is responsible for their own actions. I'm not saying that if some neo-Nazi goes out and commits a mass shooting, as happened at Buffalo and as happened in the Dylan Roof case in Charleston, that that's somehow the fault of an Antifa activist or um, a left-wing activist. Clearly, that would be absurd. Everybody is responsible for their own actions, 100%. But I do think that political extremes can fuel one another. I'll give an example. When we look at certain woke ideology and narratives, when they talk about white privilege, it's a term I hate. It's a term that I've challenged in these videos before. Now, this is something that I find really galling. If people challenge that, woke leftists will say, "Oh, you're gravitating to the far right," but they fail to see that it's precisely that sort of language that polarizes people in the first place. For example, if you have a poor white person in rural West Virginia or Arkansas or Lancashire, and their lived experience, to use that popular woke vernacular, just doesn't correspond to this notion of privilege, all it's going to do is fuel anger. If you have, for example, someone who's looking at the scale of grooming gang abuse in this country, where predominantly young white girls were groomed by predominantly British Pakistani men, often for racist purposes because they saw them as cheap. Um, when you look at something like that, and then you get some woke leftist student or academic saying, "But we need to challenge whiteness in society." And promoting garbage like "Why I No Longer Speak to White People" by Renee Lodge. When you get that sort of narrative, all that's going to do for people who may already be feeling frustrated and polarized, maybe they're unemployed, maybe they're struggling with, as we all are, with rising living costs, but there could be something going on in their life. And when you get the woke left constantly telling them that they have to apologize for the color of their skin, um, I do think it's going to push them more in the wrong direction. Now, of course, going to the far right would be the wrong approach. That won't bring them anything positive. Um, but this is how radicalization happens. People look for vacuums. Young Muslim men who might be going through depression or loneliness or other such situations, they could possibly be groomed by Islamist groups. They're then told the West is your enemy, the West keeps you down. Same with young black men. They're told you're living in this overbearing white society. All the problems you face, fault of white people. So it's this, you find this with extremes across the board. It's always about blaming someone else. It's always about blaming, I was going to say the government, but more often than not, it's also about blaming another demographic. So, a young white person who might be struggling um, with unemployment or it could be anything. Far right types will exploit their frustration and say it's the fault of the immigrants, which is overly simplistic. Of course, it's not that simplistic at all, but that's what they'll do. And the left always talk about this, but they fail to introspect. They fail to say, well, actually, it's some of this polarizing language that we're using part of the problem. You're not going to reach out to people. You're not going to meet them halfway by telling them that they're the enemy. Um, Unless, of course, the only caveat I would make there is I think some people are beyond reason. Um, and it's a waste of time trying to get them to see reason. Um, I mean, someone who believes that the Jews control all the world's money and finances and are responsible for all the wars and all the rest of it, you can't get someone like that to see you halfway. But this is why the Prevent program is so, so important. And I question those who rail against it. I'm thinking, why are you railing against it? For Islamists who rail against it, they say it only targets Muslims. That is false. It doesn't. Then leftists will say it only targets Muslims. It doesn't. It targets the far right as well. This is one of the most disingenuous arguments that the left make that only Muslim extremists are targeted. Um, you see this all the time. Whenever there's an Islamist terror attack, there's a lot of whataboutery goes on. You do get it on the other side, of course. When far right extremism is called out, you will get right wingers trying to downplay it. Now, condemning an atrocity should be a no-brainer to anyone, but I don't think the left is totally blameless when it comes to fueling the flames of this sort of polarization and division. When they use hateful terms like white privilege, I mean, it's a dehumanizing term because it's lumping everyone into one group, and I totally hate it. I hate it because I think it's causing serious problems, and I do worry about what's going on in our universities when students are being indoctrinated with this nonsense. I've no problem with, for example, the transatlantic slave trade being taught. I've no problem with Jim Crow being taught, the history of segregation, the civil rights movement. That's all fine. It's part of history, it's important. But the woke left won't settle with that. They want this never ending dystopian hellscape of grievance. If you're black and you're struggling, that's the fault of white people. It's not that you may be personally unfortunate, or that's perhaps underplaying it. Take the issue of police brutality. Um, there may well be a situation where black people are disproportionately affected, but groups like Black Lives Matter, they send out the narrative that only black people are affected. And for a group that supposedly cares about Black lives, they have got next to nothing to say about one of the biggest causes of premature death among young black men, gang violence. You know, groups like the Bloods and the Crips are essentially terrorist organizations. I mean, they're just as bad as um, QAnon extremists or the other armed nuts that you get on the right. Um, I think America's in a very serious situation right now. And I wonder, where are the moderates? Why, come on, American moderates, you need to be more vocal. Really, the far right and the far left are both taking the platform. Um, I honestly think that someone who's pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or pushing, other such inflammatory ideas out there, um, they're dangerous. But I honestly think that far left types pushing this narrative of never-ending victimhood are just as dangerous. I really do. They're just as dangerous because they're not bringing hope to anybody. That's not a hopeful movement. It's not a positive movement. Um, and I know people in my own life that subscribe to this sort of woke left ideology, and it saddens me and it frustrates me. So I'm someone who stood against all extremes, and I'm proud of that. But I realize the challenge because they fuel one another. And I'm not saying, by the way, that an activist at Berkeley who is telling black students that they're victims of institutional white racism. I'm not saying they're the same as some white supremacist gunmen. I'm not saying that. But all of these things, they just divide society. They're toxic, absolutely toxic. I think we can address injustices, address police brutality, address the reasons why perhaps black people are disproportionately incarcerated. Yeah, address all of that. For example, there may well be situations where people reasonably ask, let's say, for example, there's a black woman, there was a case like this. She went for a job interview and she had her child in the car, the window was down, the car was just there beside the job centre or whatever they're called in the States, and she was charged with child neglect, even though she was a job interview. There are situations like that where people might say, would it happen to a white person? And maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it wouldn't. So I'm not going to totally dismiss and say everything is equal. It's not. And it would be foolish and wrong to say it is. But I still say they're collectively saying all white people are the problem. And, they can argue as much as they want that white privilege isn't doing that. They'll say, oh, but we have white allies. Um, the truth is, it's a very depressing um, situation to see these extremes get ever more polarized. And I mean, the focus on those videos I was watching was about the far right and neo-Nazi types. So let's tackle it. But I do not think the left help when they endorse far left ideology, because all this does is polarize people. I'm going to wrap this up, but if you are a left wing activist and you're trying to get young people away from these far right neo-Nazi types, for God's sake, don't use the narrative of white privilege. That's not going to get them on board. That's just going to make them defensive, especially if it's not their lived experience. Um, there was a Tory MP a while back was talking about reporting teachers who use this term to prevent. I wouldn't go that far, but I certainly think that we need to be very, very scrutinizing of something like critical race theory, given some of the ideas it comes out with. I mean, this ideology literally states that if you have a black thug who attacks an Asian person, that's not their fault. No, no, no. They're simply exhibiting the inherent racism of whiteness in society. And they're simply a product of the whiteness in society, questioning whiteness. monitoring microaggressions, all the sort of crap that comes from woke activists really has a lot to answer for. The thing about microaggressions, University of Sheffield, we're paying students to inform on one another for alleged microaggressions. So if you're at a party and you're making small talk, oh, hey, what's your name? What sort of music do you like? By the way, where are you from? Oh, that's a microaggression if they're a minority because you're saying they're not British, when really you might just be making conversation. Um, and this is what I despise about the woke left, the fact that, or I'll rephrase that, what I despise about their thinking. You know, it's not good to hate individuals, but what I despise about their thinking is they will attack something sinister to everything. They can't let it go. They can't let it rest. Everything has to have a more sinister plot, and in that sense, they're actually it's kind of conspiracy theories. It's kind of like the same. Again, this is getting back to two sides of the same coin, because the far right are constantly fishing for grievances. The far left do the same thing, and I do consider wokeism to be far left. It's not moderate. It's not compassionate. It's not reasonable. It's far left ideology. Not necessarily in the traditional far left sense of the workers divide the means and communistic, not in that sense. It's kind of like the new left zealotry, I guess. Um, but I fear this situation is going to get worse. And I really think it's a responsibility of moderate centrists, people who abhor both extremes, to call it out consistently. One problem we have is moderate, well, I'm not even sure if I'd use the term moderate, but let's say conservatives. They will call out the woke left, but they're not vocal enough about neo-Nazi and far right groups. But moderate leftists are also have a blind spot. They'll condemn the far right and they'll condemn Trump cultists and all that sort of stuff, but they will not recognize the extremes on their side. And this is the biggest failure of our times, is that people get so partisan that they cannot and will not recognize the extremes on their own side. And then we're left with those extremes being enabled. Now, it disheartens me when I see something like why I no longer talk to white people about race promoted as something positive. I don't really care if the content is a bit more moderate and balanced and reasonable. The very fact that she chose that cover shows to me what her agenda is polarizing. It's saying that white people are the problem and I don't want to speak to them. Oh, but please buy my book. It's complete nonsense. And I'm talking about that one because it has been actively promoted in this country by Waterstones, by woke activists. You get someone like Emma Watson lapping it up. What I would say to Renee Lodge is, well, I'm not sure if I should talk to you because you don't want me to. I'm respecting your wishes. After all, I'm a white guy. I must be the enemy. And that's another problem, minority racism is never called out. I'll just close on one point, when the whole Black Lives Matter thing was really, really, I guess, more or less at its peak in 2020, there was a backlash and it was around the term and the usage of the term. So what we began to see is all lives matter and white lives matter. Now, some of this, I mean, certainly by the likes of Patriotic Alternative, was just the far right's response. But the problem is the left's attitude to this was if you're saying white lives matter or all lives matter, you must be a racist. You must be against black lives. But the irony about this is that very exclu- exclusivity of saying Black Lives Matter, but how dare you say any other lives matter? Um, it was kind of an own goal because a lot of reasonable, moderate people who have no affiliation with far right or white supremacist groups were reasonably asking what is fundamentally wrong with saying all lives matter as a statement, as a principle. So I think instead of pushing back at that, oh, but you're pandering to the far right, you're questioning if Black Lives Matter. Why not just say yes? There's nothing fundamentally wrong with saying all lives matter. But what did they do? And this is the sort of thing that really frustrates me because I think it's just unnecessarily divisive. What do? They say, oh, but that's pure far right mantra. Anyone literally saying that, I mean, you can't get more utilitarian and anti-racist, literally, than saying as a concept, as a principle, all lives matter. All lives. It's insane. The woke left try to argue that is somehow a far right statement. There may be far right people use it, but fundamentally the statement wasn't. And that's what's so stupid about their thinking. They seem to think that they have a hissy fit over people saying that. The White Lives Matter thing is tapping into identity politics again. Um, so I wouldn't be quick to endorse that one because it's kind of playing the same game. But I don't even believe that everyone who's saying White Lives Matter were all far right types or associated with patriotic alternative. Um, Maybe they were making the point that in areas where white lives are disproportionately impacted, let's talk about it. The dishonesty of the woke left is insufferable. I'll wrap this up, but I really, really think this comes down to being consistent in challenging extremes. And part of that is recognizing there is a problem with neo Nazi, violent, intolerant thugs. I mean, it's toxic stuff, and no reasonable person should should pander to that in any way. But I think the attitude of the hard left has been a big mistake. Take, for example, I will close with this point. Hope Not Hate. Now, on the surface, you might think, oh, they're a good group, they're tackling fascism. Here's my problem with Hope Not Hate. They pretend to be a group opposing intolerance. They don't even necessarily specify we're against the far right. They say they're against hate and intolerance, but they have shamefully said nothing, done nothing about Islamist hate preaching against Jews, against women, against gay people. They're silent. And yet, that has been one of the most graphically illustrated examples of violent intolerance in this country in recent times. Hope Not Hate has been silent. They did have one guy, I think he was actually one of the co founders, who did try to raise this issue, and he was immediately denounced. I think Hope Not Hate is not the nice, reasonable anti racism group that it pretends to be. I think it's a pretty hard left group that's selective in their outrage. I used to support them. I mean, I used to think, yeah, they're good. It's important that we tackle fascism. I still think that. But let's tackle it with some consistency as well. You cannot say you're against hate and extremism if you're going to cherry pick which hate and extremism that you're against. That's why, as far as I'm concerned, hope will not hate. I mean, when we see Islamist attacks, when we saw a teacher forced into hiding, they had exactly nothing to say. Shameful, cowardly on the part of Hope Not Hate. That's why I don't support them anymore. I used to. This is why I don't support them, because they're not consistent. And their failure to speak up on these issues, their failure to be consistent, I think doesn't help. I think it galvanizes problems. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. Thanks for watching.